I designed my very own PokeDoku Puzzle. PokeDoku is a fun daily browser game, similar to Wordle. The game is simple. There is a 3x3 grid, and every row or column has a property from the Pokemon games on it, like a type or a region. For every square on the grid, you need to think of a Pokemon that shares both properties from the row and the column. Since I had the honor of creating one of these wonderful puzzles myself, what do you think I did with this opportunity? I could have put some famous joke Pokemon on here like Makago or Iron Jugulus, but I decided instead to highlight some Pokemon from Gen 3 competitive play that I don't get to talk about too much. For the first square in my puzzle, we need to choose a ground type from the Hoenn region. The obvious choice would be Swampert, a top tier Pokemon in Gen 3 competitive and a staple of overused. But I went with a different defensive ground type for my pick, Flygon. I don't get to talk about Gen 3 Flygon too much, but it's an interesting part of the metagame. Gen 3 is a world where rock resist is very important. Tyranitar and Aerodactyl are the two scariest threats in the whole game. They can absolutely eat you alive if you don't have a solid response to them. And usually on most teams that response is going to be Swampert. It's really consistent, has Water Ground, a fantastic defensive type. It checks Tyranitar very consistently, and it even helps against Metagross and Salamence. Flygon is a bit more limited in comparison. Seems like you would probably not want to use it over Swamp. It does not have a Water Ground typing. Instead, it has a Dragon Ground typing, which has its benefits. Flygon is neutral to Grass, which comes in handy. It's also times 4 weak to Ice, which is an exploitable point, and overall not going to be as good as Swampert. Gets pretty destroyed by Skarmory. Doesn't have a great way to threaten the most common defensive Pokemon in the game, Skarmory. And its stats are not as good. Swampert has way more solid stats, high attack, high HP. Flygon on the other hand, it's got 80 in all these. It's faster. That's a benefit, but overall not as desirable. But what's great about Flygon in particular is that it has this ability right here, Levitate, which is truly excellent. Levitate means you're immune to ground type, and it means that you are not affected by spikes at all. And Swampert, on the other hand, is affected by spikes, and a common way to wear down Swampert during the course of a game is by forcing it in repeatedly, making it step on the spikes. But Flygon is a unique Pokemon that can be a response to Tyranitar and Aerodactyl, and Salamence to an extent with Rock Slide and Toxic up its sleeve. And also just completely ignores spikes. It almost feels like this guy has Magic Guard before Magic Guard was a thing, because it doesn't get hit by Sandstorm or spikes. It can just sidestep a lot of the progress-making mechanics in the game. So Flygon is a staple on a team style called Superman, which aims to ignore spikes as much as possible. You use Skarmory yourself, it's immune to spikes. You use something like Gengar, sometimes a fringe defensive Pokemon like Weezing can make an appearance on there. Basically, the aim is to ignore spikes from your enemy. And Flygon is the only Pokemon in the game that is solid against Tyranitar and Aerodactyl, which you need while being immune to spikes. That is the main benefit of it. And most sets are going to be a defensive Flygon set like this, with just enough speed to outrun Tyranitar, and then some dumped into defense and the rest in health. Toxic allows you to make progress against enemy walls. The problem with Flygon though, like I mentioned before, is that Skarmory can kind of take advantage of it, but what's nice about Superman teams is that they're not as worried about Skarmory as other teams, because they can ignore Skarmory's spike. It makes sense to run Flygon on a team that overall doesn't care about Skarmory, so that weakness is not as big of a deal. And Flygon has some interesting options too. Some sets do run Fire Blast as some sort of way to hit Skarmory super effectively. Regrettably, you don't have the best special attack in the world, and if you invest in special attack, I mean, you're really suffering in other areas, aren't you? Skarmory often has full special defense in this generation too, so that won't do much. It'll do something like 30-ish%, but it's a valid option on some teams. You can also go offensive Flygon with a substitute, go max speed. You can actually be quite fast with Flygon, much faster than Swampert can be. You got good old ground rock coverage, which is pretty excellent. And with attack investment, you got a base 100 attack. You're pretty hard hitting with Flygon. HP Bug is a good option because it hits Claydol and Celebi, who would otherwise totally farm this particular set with everything else it has. I actually think offensive Flygon is a bit underrated. It's pretty scary on the right team. It needs usually support from Magneton to get rid of Skarmory, but with that and maybe some paralysis support too, Flygon can be quite an offensive threat. And Choice Band Flygon is also occasionally seen. Just be as aggressive as possible with Flygon. What's cool about this set is that it runs Gust, which is a terrible move, but with the Choice Band boost and the fact that it's ×4 super effective, it can actually one-hit KO Heracross and Breloom, which is more useful than anything else you can do with this set, usually. Maybe you could roll like Double Edge or something, but Gust allows you that significant one-hit KO, which is cool. I really like Flygon. It's a great Pokemon design overall. It stands out from Swampert in unique ways. It's not completely outclassed, and it's one of the most fun parts about playing Gen 3 OU is access to unique options like this. They kind of suck later on, but back in Gen 3 this was a competitive Pokemon. It was good. For the second square on my PokeDoku grid, I have to pick a mono-type ground Pokemon. So I went with a fringe choice in Gen 3 that occasionally props up in competitive play. Donphan, one of my personal favorite defensive Pokemon to use. Donphan is cool because it's just a ground type. It is not as threatened by ×4 super effective moves because there are none against it. Swampert is under fire from grass type attacks that hit it for massive damage, Flygon from ice type attacks, but Donphan can manage against those coverage types that threaten these other Pokemon more significantly. And what's cool about Donphan is that it is a bulky ground type with a rapid spin on it. And this is really good roll compression. Swampert does not have rapid spin. Flygon does not have rapid spin. Claydol is the obvious choice that you would probably expect to be a more go-to rapid spinner, but what's unfortunate about Claydol is this secondary psychic typing, which leaves it open to a lot of super effective damage from specifically ghost coverage like Shadow Ball, bug moves from Heracross or Tyranitar, and Aerodactyl and Tyranitar have both started pretty commonly running bug moves to hit not only Claydol but Pokemon like Starmie and Celebi. So it sucks to be a bulky ground type. Your job is to answer Tyranitar and Aerodactyl, but they have a super effective option to threaten you significantly. So Donphan is a bulky ground type that is not as threatened by that, and it has rapid spin on it. And this thing has great defensive stats and a pretty good attack stat too. It can actually hit quite hard. Hidden Power Rock is used here. You may think, why not use Rock Slide? Well, actually the accuracy on Hidden Power Rock, as well as the extra PP, is worth the slight loss of power. It's 5 less power for more accuracy and more PP. And this is insanely solid versus most offensive physical attackers in the game, to be honest. Tyranitar cannot really touch you. Aerodactyl has big problems against you. Salamence as well. You can come in and shrug off all of their physical damage and hit them with a super effective rock follow-up. Even Gyarados, who is actually a little bit awkward for Swampert to answer sometimes, because Swampert runs Ice Beam to hit Salamence, but Ice Beam does not threaten Gyarados, and Swampert can't usually afford to run rock moves. So Donphan has that advantage. It is way better at checking Gyarados than Swampert or even Flygon. It just has higher defense. And it can clear hazards from the field with Rapid Spin too. What sucks about Donphan though, and its biggest shortcoming, is that it has a terrible matchup into 2 common Pokemon, Skarmory and Gengar. Skarmory comes in and just totally doesn't care about any of your moves. And you want a rapid spin against them ideally, but they can just poison you and you will slowly lose that 1v1. Gengar is immune to ground, takes almost nothing from HP Rock, and is immune to rapid spin. It can completely block you from rapid spinning, which is your whole thing. So usually Donphan needs support not only from Magneton to trap and eliminate Skarmory, but also from Pursuit Tyranitar to trap and eliminate Gengar. But once you take out those 2 key enemies, Donphan becomes a menace. It becomes a really sturdy defensive Pokemon, especially in a metagame that often stacks rock types to try and overwhelm Swampert. That's a very common game plan. Donphan is way more solid than Swampert can be, oftentimes, and the fact that you have Rapid Spin means you're not as vulnerable to spikes as Swampert is, because you can remove them yourself. Definitely a solid choice with the right support in OU. Not OU ranked, because it's not as easy to fit on teams as something like Swampert, because it requires all that support. But with that support, this Pokemon can do very well. For the next square in my PokeDoku grid, we need to choose a Pokemon with both ground and rock typing. So I went with another cool fringe viable choice in Gen 3 competitive. Rhydon. Rhydon is a very cool one, folks. Rhydon is interesting because it's not very good as a bulky ground type anymore. That was its main purpose back in Gen 2 and Gen 1. It was the ground type of those games, but now there's new ground types taking its job, like Swampert, Flygon, even Donphan, and even Claydol. But Rhydon has an upper hand over all the other ground types, and that is the fact that it has this typing right here, ground and rock, which sucks defensively. Like your ×4 weak to water and grass, which is very rough, but not much benefit defensively. But what's nice about it is that you have stab damage on both Earthquake and Rock Slide. And you'll notice Rhydon has a really great attack stat of a base 130. So what you can do with Rhydon is use it on an archetype called Paraspam, because of course Rhydon's biggest downfall is that it's very slow. While you have these great offensive advantages, 2 great attacking types, great attack stat, you have to actually be able to hit the enemy. Usually that is through speed. You've got to be faster than them. But Rhydon is slower than just about everything, so it needs some support. And that support can come in the form of paralysis. Paralysis will hinder your enemy's speed stat by 75% when applied. So if you run a team that has multiple paralysis spreaders, like a Starmie with Thunder Wave, Jirachi with Body Slam, which has a higher chance to inflict paralysis via Serene Grace, maybe a Porygon 2 with Thunder Wave, Gyarados with Thunder Wave, there's a lot of options. Rhydon is really powerful against paralyzed enemies. You outrun them, you have one of the scariest offensive coverage combinations in the game, and similar to how Flygon I mentioned before runs bug coverage to hit Claydol and Celebi, who are actually quite good against these two types, Rhydon happens to get the perfect complementary coverage option of Megahorn. Megahorn is a massive 120 power bug type attack that not many Pokemon get. Rhydon is very lucky to get it, and it's the perfect thing for it, allowing you to just one-hit Celebi and often one-hit Claydol too. Rhydon does only fit on that specific style though, but it's interesting because it's like one of the best Pokemon on that style. And it's a pretty good team style. Spreading paralysis and using these slow but very threatening offensive Pokemon, it's simple but it works, and Rhydon was made for that. What's nice about this as well is that paralysis has the disruption effect. There's a 1 in 4 chance that paralyzed Pokemon cannot move. So substitute means you can pass a turn and eventually fish for them to be fully paralyzed so that you have the safety net of a substitute in front of you. And Rock Slide has this flinch chance on it for the infamous Para Flinch strategy, where you basically stack multiple immobility effects on top of each other. Flinching means they can't act, paralysis means they can't act. So if you Rock Slide a paralysis enemy, they've got a pretty high chance to not act from 2 different effects that can hinder them from action. So yeah, Rhydon, a staple of Paraspam. For the 4th square in my PokeDoku grid, I need to choose a steel type from the Hoenn region. So I went with Jirachi, one of the staples of Gen 3 OU. Believe it or not, I have never made a dedicated video about Jirachi, even though it's one of the best Pokemon in Gen 3 OU. I'll probably get to that at some point, but for now, let's chat about it here. Jirachi is famously versatile with 100 stats in everything, so it can really specialize in whatever it wants to. It can be a defensive Pokemon, an offensive Pokemon, a utility Pokemon, and everything in between, a bit of both in many cases, and it can fit on a lot of different team styles because of this versatility. Not only in its stats that can be specialized into whatever area you want, but also its move pool, which has just about everything you could ask for. You've got Calm Mind for an offensive boost, a lot of offensive coverage options like Stab Psychic, but even the Elemental Punches for those coverage options, Thunderbolt and Thunder. And the most infamous part of Jirachi is its ability Serene Grace, which doubles the chances that secondary effects will occur. And this has a very controversial application from Gen 4 onwards, where the move Iron Head, which has a 30% flinch chance, gets buffed to 60%. So Jirachi can just sit there Iron Heading you over and over, and it has a 60% chance to just prevent you from moving. It's pretty annoying. Sometimes Jirachi can just Iron Head you repeatedly until you slowly but surely face down the void, which is not very fun. Luckily, in Gen 3, Jirachi does not get Iron Head yet, making it feel a little bit less ridiculous, a little bit less annoying than it does later. Jirachi is interesting because it can sometimes be an alternative to Blissey as a special wall with a set like this. You are quite nice defensively. You have the great Wish Protect combo. You're Steel type, meaning you don't get affected by Sandstorm, so you can rack up chip healing, which is nice. You also help against Aerodactyl because they're choice banded, so they can't lock into Rock Slide or Double Edge safely if they want to sweep. So Jirachi can help out in that matchup. You can spread paralysis with a 60% paralysis chance on Body Slam, which is great on those Paraspam teams. But Jirachi has some shortcomings over Blissey. Blissey is a normal type, and it has natural cure, meaning it can heal status on switch out. You don't have any way to heal status, so you're vulnerable to Will-O-Wisp and Thunderwave in particular, which can just seriously hinder your ability to actually function as a wall. Jirachi is also vulnerable to both of the trappers present in Gen 3 OU, Dugtrio and Magneton. Dugtrio can trap you and hit you with a super effective Earthquake. Magneton can trap you with Magnet Pull because you're a Steel type, and often 1v1 you, or at least finish you off if you're too low health, with its very powerful Thunderbolts and Thunderwave as well to hinder you further. So Jirachi has a lot of advantages, but it's also under fire from a lot of different things. But I appreciate its versatility. I like that you can run this set right here is pretty cool. Substitute Calm Mind Jirachi, because with 404 health exactly, your substitute is 1/4 of that, meaning your substitute has 101 health. And that's very good against Blissey, who usually deals with Jirachi through Seismic Toss, which deals a flat 100 damage. But because your substitute has 101 health, they can't break it in one hit. It takes 2 hits. So Jirachi can sometimes 1v1 Blissey, even though it's a special attacker. You can substitute and rack up Calm Mind boosts and eventually get to a point where you're so strong from the boosts that you can 1 or 2 hit KO them even. What can be annoying about Jirachi is that it has a 20% chance to freeze with this move right here. here, Ice Punch. And this was controversial enough to actually have a rule put in place in Gen 3 called the Freeze Clause, which also exists in Gen 1, where you cannot freeze multiple Pokemon at the same time. Because Jirachi would sometimes just spam Ice Punch, and that 20% chance to freeze is massive, considering how powerful freeze is. So you could just fish for freezes, and it was pretty stupid. So now at least you can only freeze one Pokemon at a time. I like Jirachi's versatility. I don't like that it can sometimes just win a game through a lucky secondary effect like a 20% freeze or a Fire Punch 20% burn. So I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with Jirachi. It is cool, it is versatile, it fills important roles, ticks important boxes, but also leads to some frustrating situations. And sometimes its versatility is also annoying because you don't know what moveset it could be. You don't know what it could do. Sometimes it will hit you with something crazy like Choice Band Hidden Power Fighting, which is kind of funny because usually Tyranitar comes in on Jirachi and threatens it with Earthquake, but now you can just one-hit KO them with Hidden Power Fighting and attack because, of course, you have pretty good attack stat. You have 100 in everything. So yeah, Jirachi is an enigma. You never know what it's going to do. And sometimes even if you do, it gets you with a freeze. For the 5th square on my PokeDoku grid, we have to choose a mono-type Steel Pokemon, and I have gone with, of course, Registeel from Gen 3. Registeel is interesting because on the surface it seems like it would be amazing. I mean, Steel is a great defensive type. And look at the stats, 150 defense and special defense and decent HP too. Even pretty good attack considering how bulky you are. But the biggest issue with Registeel is probably just simply that it is not Metagross. Metagross is another Steel type that has it beat in most areas. Similarly defensively bulky, but way more offensively threatening, has an extremely hard-hitting explosion. Meteor Mash, which Registeel does not get, which is a great Steel type attack with a really high power and a chance to raise your attack. So Metagross is generally a more desirable choice. What's nice about Metagross is also its Steel Psychic typing is quite good. So it's neutral to fighting, whereas Registeel is weak to fight. But Registeel does have its applications over Metagross occasionally, and it's a pretty interesting choice when you do see it prop up on a team. Most notably is the special defense stat is way better on Registeel. Metagross can get worn down just by a hard-hitting stab. Special attack like a Starmie Hydro Pump is a big one that Metagross cannot cleanly switch in against. Registeel, on the other hand, is a pretty nice mixed wall, meaning it has good defense and special defense. It can handle both sides of the offensive spectrum, which is quite useful. Registeel has some utility that Metagross does not, Thunder Wave being the big one. The ability to inflict paralysis is also very useful. Registeel is pretty effective at using counter because of how many incoming hits it can take. Dugtrio may be able to trap it and deal a decent amount of damage with Earthquake, but you are too bulky to feint to that. So they will often be the one losing that exchange because you just counter and take them out in a single hit with the counter damage. Registeel gets Explosion too, helping it to be a bit more versatile. You can also use Curse Registeel sets, which on Stolia teams are a great win condition. Once Registeel gets moving with the Curse boosts, it becomes kind of indestructible. Unlike Snorlax, another Curse user who may be more offensively threatening, Registeel is not worried about Sandstorm damage because of its Steel typing, so it has that going for it. This kind of set on Registeel has actually been rising in popularity quite a bit recently and been used by pro players in tournaments. Curse Registeel being a pretty nice win condition for more defensively leaning teams. It's interesting, similar to Flygon, how it is overall worse than Swampert, but it has unique traits that set it apart. Registeel is similar. While Metagross is a more splashable and common Steel type that is on more teams overall, Registeel has unique qualities that give it value sometimes, which I think is interesting. For the 6th square on my PokeDoku grid, we have to choose a Steel Rock type Pokemon. So I went with Aggron, another Pokemon introduced in Gen 3 that has occasional uses. Aggron is a rather unfortunate Pokemon, kind of suffering from the flaws that many rock types suffer from, where it's very stacked in the attack and defense side, but has like nothing in the other stats. And Steel Rock is also kind of a bad typing. Steel is usually great, but paired with Rock, you are now ×4 weak to ground and fighting, which is very rough. Two common physical attacking types, and you're supposed to be a physical wall, so how are you supposed to do that job? But what Aggron does provide is an interesting interaction that you can take advantage of. Compared to other rock-type physical attackers, Aggron is immune to poison. Think of Tyranitar and Aerodactyl. They cannot switch directly into Skarmory because both of them are worried about getting poisoned by Toxic, which wears them down. It makes them less effective as offensive Pokemon. But Aggron is not scared of that. Aggron can pretty cleanly switch right into a Skarmory and start being a nuisance to it. You can Focus Punch it. Most Skarmory sets don't run any attacks, So you can just focus punch and hit them for pretty considerable physical damage, wearing them down. Even if they make spikes, they are slowly getting worn down, which you probably want. You can also paralyze them with Thunder Wave, which is very crippling to Skarmory, disrupting it, preventing it from being able to sit there and protect over and over safely because of the disruption effect. And you can start para-flinching them too with Rock Slide and Thunder Wave stacked up. They're not going to love switch staying in there. And what's cool about Aggron is that it fits on the rock spam style of team where you're trying to lure in Swampert and wear it down with spikes repeatedly. Because if a Swampert tries to come in, which it may want to, it has water and ground type moves that threaten you. They'll be stepping on spikes and taking a pretty significant focus punch. I mean, you're a hard-hitting Pokemon with 110 attack. That's not bad. Aggron, I think it's really fun to use and very cool. It is rough though to put it on a team because it just makes you suffer so much defensively. You need a lot of support for it elsewhere. And Aggron teams can often find themselves getting eaten alive by a simple, like a Metacham or something. One of those really threatening fighting types that can just drop you in a single hit. But I think the niche of being able to switch in on Skarmory safely and lure in Swampert is actually decent. It's usable, and it's cool. For the 7th square on my PokeDoku grid, we need to choose a water type from the Hoenn region. So I have gone with one of my favorites, Ludicolo. I think Ludicolo is very cool. It is a water grass type Pokemon, and it has the ability Swift Swim, which grants double speed in the rain. Ludicolo's biggest competitor is Kingdra, another Swift Swim Pokemon with the ability to take advantage of Rain Dance and clean up at endgames thanks to the speed boost and water type damage boost. And Water Dragon is an overall better defensive typing than Water Grass, with only one weakness to Dragon. Ludicolo, on the other hand, has unfortunate weaknesses to Flying and Bug, which can be exploited. But Ludicolo has some value that Kingdra doesn't. Specifically, it has access to Leech Seed right here. Leech Seed is a great move that applies a seed effect to the enemy, dealing damage to them while healing you. And it is a great way to just sort of guarantee make some safe progress. A little chip damage to them, some healing for you. Celebi commonly uses it, and because Ludicolo has Leech Seed, it is a bit more valuable in the mid game than Kingdra is. Kingdra kind of has to go all in on the Rain Dance thing after it comes in. It has to very aggressively go for that win condition. But Ludicolo can take more time. It can switch in once, throw out a Leech Seed, come back in later. It doesn't have to commit to the Rain Dance sweep right away. And it's not as offensively threatening as Kingdra is. It's got a bit lower stats, but the fact that it has this Leech Seed option means that you can eventually set up for a Rain Dance sweep more consistently, I think. What's nice about Ludicolo too is grass typing means it is actually immune to enemy Leech Seed from Celebi, which is nice. Grass types cannot be affected by Leech Seed. And also it is ground resistant, which comes up against Metagross. In fact, Ludicolo is actually a pretty good switch in to Metagross, a famously difficult Pokemon to switch in against. You resist Steel and you resist ground. The best they can do is hit you with a Rock Slide, which is non-stab boosted and pretty low power, so that's not very threatening. And they get kind of punished by Leech Seed. They usually have high health investment, many of them, so Ludicolo is much sturdier against Metagross than Kingdra is. Ludicolo also has an alternative rain ability, Rain Dish, which grants an extra leftovers healing in the rain, basically. You can use this to be a bit more defensive with Ludicolo if you prefer, running something like this, Rain Dance, Protect, Toxic Leech Seed perhaps, and leaning more into defensive stats, using it as a more sturdy Metagross switch-in that can stick around for ages and just chip heal all the way back repeatedly. And that can have some value on teams that aim to use weather clear strategies. Some teams want to eliminate Tyranitar, who is a Sandstorm setter, and then clear weather permanently, which enables a teammate like a Heracross with a Salakberry. If sand was up, they would faint to the Sandstorm after bringing themselves down to low health to eat the berry, but without sand on the field, they can thrive and sometimes be a really, really scary offensive threat. So Ludicolo, with a set like this, could just have the job of clearing weather for teammates that appreciate weather being cleared. I think it's such a cool Pokemon design, because its stats are modest, but it has this awesome application in competitive that is kind of varied in as well, because you can go defensive or offensive. And I like that it can set up with, thanks to Leech Seed, it can do the chip damage to set up for its own win condition later with the Swift Swim Rain Dance. I love that. The 8th square on my PokeDoku grid is a mono-type water Pokemon. And who else but Wailord to choose for this one? Yes, Wailord is actually usable in Gen 3 OU, and it's very fun. This Pokemon is a mono water type that I have not talked about in a video before, but one of the funniest guys in Gen 3 that I love to use. And its big thing is that it has Water Spout, which is a really hard hard-hitting water-type attack, abused by Kyogre in later generations, but originally just a Wailord move. Deals damage based on how much health you have. So if you're at 100% health, it deals the maximum damage of 150 power. It lowers the lower your health is. What's cool about Wailord as well is that it has self-destruct on it, which is a slightly weaker version of Explosion. And this means that Blissey is not safe against. Blissey usually is a hard counter to any special attacker, but self-destruct, you can actually KO them after water spout damage. So Wailord can create this mind game where they want to go to Blissey, but also they don't want to go to Blissey. You could explode at any point and just eliminate their guy. And often you can stack special threats on your team after eliminating Blissey and just overwhelm them. The Wailord puts them in a very awkward position. It's a pretty fun lead, especially if you face a Tyranitar. They are forced out. You can get surprising value from the water spout spam, which does really, really massive damage. You also force out Salamence leads because you have Ice Beam. Zapdos is an awkward lead matchup, but you can either cover it elsewhere or sometimes run a specific EV spread to live Zapdos Thunderbolt and explode against it. That's something you can do. A pretty simple Pokemon, all things considered, but it's a fun thing to just have this mind game against Blissey and sometimes just blow them up. Always satisfying to blow up a Blissey. And finally, the last square of my PokeDoku grid is a water and rock type Pokemon. I have gone with Omastar, who actually has occasional competitive use in Gen 3. Omastar is yet another Swift Swim Pokemon. So competing with Kingdra and Ludicolo, who are both generally way better. Water Rock is a bad defensive typing. It's times 4 Grass weak, Fighting and Ground weak. It's got a lot of problems. But what Omastar does have going for it is a really massive defense stat, which means you can actually sometimes come in against targets like Snorlax and be more sturdy against them than your fellow Rain Dance Pokemon, especially because you resist normal type attacks. Aerodactyl is scared to lock in against Double Edge, which you can sometimes turn against them with a counter Rain Dance, and then you outrun them and hit them with Hydro Pump. And what is also cool about Omastar is that it gets Spikes, which is kind of random on an offensive threat, but it gets them. Spikes are an entry hazard that the whole metagame centers around, really. So it's super nice to be able to create Spikes when you're forcing something out. Maybe you Rain Dance and you're steering down an Aerodactyl. They obviously want to go to their Blissey, but instead of just doing the straightforward attack, you make Spikes, which those Spikes will deal damage to their whole team for the rest of the game, instead of the temporary damage you would have dealt with Hydro Pump. So it's cool to have that option on a Rain Dance threat. You can sometimes find opportunities to further your advantage and make Spikes in positions where you are threatening the enemy's life. Omastar is actually also extremely good in Ubers, because Kyogre is a teammate who can create rain with its ability Drizzle. And on rain teams, Omastar is one of the best Swift Swim Pokemon in the game. It's actually better than Kingdra and Ludicolo up in Ubers, primarily because of its rock typing, which in OU is a huge detriment, but in Ubers is really good because it provides resistance to extreme speed. Deoxys Attack is one of the most common Pokemon in Gen 3 Ubers. A monstrous offensive threat with, I mean, just look at these stats, they're crazy. But Extreme Speed is a staple on this Pokemon, a hard-hitting priority move, but Omastar resists it, whereas Kingdra and Ludicolo are vulnerable to it. Not very nice when you have this Swift Swim Pokemon trying to be faster than everything that gets beat by a priority move, which doesn't care about your speed stat, but resisting the most commonly used priority move in Ubers means you are way more consistent at doing your job of sweeping with Swift Swim up. So Omastar is more desirable in Ubers than other Swift Swim Pokemon are, interestingly, and I think that's quite cool. Thank you to PokeDoku for reaching out to me and allowing me to design this puzzle for you today. Hopefully you enjoyed my Pokemon choices and my explanation of why I chose them. It's nice to be able to highlight some fun Pokemon in Gen 3 competitive that I don't often get to talk about in my other videos. Thank you.